Hi everybody, my name is Hajar Rahmani. I'll be presenting a paper What to Do When You Can't Do It All, Temporal Logic Planning with Subtemporal Logic Constraints by me and Jason O'Kane from University of South Carolina. Consider a social enrichment robot capable of doing 2x juggling and making animal balloons located in a retirement home. The robot is assigned different kind of tasks, or perhaps there are some constraints. Some of those tasks and constraints might be conflicting. We study what to do for the case where the task and the constraints are given as LTL formulas. The main contribution of this work is a greedy algorithm that synthesizes a short trajectory that satisfies an LTL goal while satisfying an optimal selection of possibly conflicting LTL sub-constraints or goals. We also present two case studies and an experiment studying the solution quality of our algorithm. Several related work consider temporal logic planning in situations where no satisfiable planar system is synthesizable. Our own previous work studies a problem very similar to the problem we study in this paper. In that work, LDLF, which is a logic for finite traces, was used to express the sub-constraints. Here we use LTL to express sub-constraints. By LDLF, we could impose constraints on the finite prefixes of the infinite trajectory, but we cannot specify a goal that is satisfiable by an infinite trajectory. For example, the sub-constraint cannot be in the form that the robot must infinitely often perform juggling. Tuvama and others consider the same problem we study here, but without the hard constraint. Their algorithm makes a transition-weighted product automaton and then uses a nested DFS to synthesize a lasso, or make a different product automaton and provide a different algorithm. We also aim to synthesize a short plan. The environment is modeled by a transition system. Here we have an example of transition system for the retirement home example. It has 5 atomic propositions and the label of each state has propositions that indicate where the robot is located and what is doing there. The objective in LTL planning is to synthesize on a transition system an infinite path whose trace satisfies a given LTL formula. The tasks and the constraints are given as LTL formulas. In this example, phi1 tells the robot to infinitely often visit room 1. Phi2 tells the robot that whenever it performs animal balloons act in room 2, it must eventually perform juggling in that room. Each LTL formula specifies a set of infinite words, also called traces, that satisfy the formula. Here for each of the two formulas we have shown two traces. We use Buki automata to encode LTL formulas. Buki automata are very similar to non-deterministic finite automata, but they are acceptors for infinite words rather than finite words. A run over a Buki automaton is accepting if it infinitely often goes through an accepting state. An example in this automaton is the cycle Q0, Q1, Q2, Q0, or a random walk that infinitely often goes through Q2. An infinite word is accepting if there is an accepting run for it over the automaton. For each LTL formula, we can make a Buki automaton that accepts exactly all those words that satisfy the formula. The inputs to our problem are a transition system, an LTL formula phi, which specifies the goal or the hard constraint, and n LTL formulas psi1 through psi n, which specify the sub-constraints and are ordered from the highest priority to the lowest priority. The output of the problem is a path whose trace satisfies the hard constraint and minimizes a const function f omega. The sub-constraints must be first prioritized by the user. The cost function guarantees to satisfy as many as possible of the sub-constraints while never sacrificing constraint with higher priority in order to satisfy a constraint with lower priority. The algorithm consists of three main steps. The first step, make a product automaton. The second step, compute the set of strongly connected components of the graph underlying the product automaton. And the third step, synthesize a lasso. The suffix part of the lasso is synthesized inside a strongly connected component. The lasso is then projected on the transition system. The product automaton P is constructed from the Buki automata A created for the LTL goal phi, the transition system, and the Buki automata BIs created for the sub constraints. All the Buki automata for the sub constraint need to be non-blocking. The state space of P is obtained by the Cartesian product of the state spaces. Function WP assigns to each state of P a Boolean vector indicator for which of the Buki automata BIs of the sub-constraint the state is accepting. This box shows the rule for forming the transition relation of P, which basically says under what conditions a transition between two states in P is formed. Note that P is a state-weighted Buki automaton with the trivial alphabet. Here we have an example of product automaton. It has two accepting states, and the weight of each state is labeled with a vector of size 3, which means that the product automaton has constructed for three sub-constraints. In those vectors, F denotes false and T denotes true. Function inf assigns to each run over P a Boolean vector that indicates for which of the Buki automata representing the sub-constraint the run is accepting. We feed this vector to the cost function fw, which is used to indicate the cost of violation of the sub-constraints. Our original problem is then reduced to finding on P an accepting run that minimizes fw. Lemma 2 says that if P has an accepting run, then it has an accepting lasso that minimizes the const function. Because of this, we look only for lassos, because they are easier to find. A lasso has two parts, a prefix part R1, which is a path from the initial state to a midpoint, and a suffix part R2, which can form a cycle from that midpoint back to itself. Among all those lassos, we are interested in the shortest ones because usually shortest lassos on P can lead to shortest lasso on the transition system, and this could lead to minimized energy consumption or resources. But lemmas 3 and 4 say it is computationally hard to synthesize the shortest accepting lasso that minimizes the cost function. Because of this hardness, we use a greedy algorithm that minimizes R1 and R2 separately on the graph underlying P. Because R2 forms a cycle, it is within a strongly connected component of the graph. As a result, we first compute the set of strongly connected components using Tarjan's algorithm, which is a single pass depth first search that forms the strongly connected components during the callbacks. During the Tarjan algorithm, we compute for each component its weight, which will be a vector whose value indicates for which of the Buki automata of the sub-constraint it has accepting states. And we also compute whether that component has an accepting state of P or not. Tarjan's algorithm assigned to each strongly connected component a leader, which is basically the first state that is visited by DFS in that component. We synthesize R1 as a path from the initial state to the leader of the strongly connected component and synthesize R2 as a cycle from the leader to itself. The strongly connected component in which we synthesize R2 must have a weight that minimizes the const function. It also must contain at least an accepting state, but it must not be a loop-free singleton component. Note that by the same single pass of DFS, we actually have a prefix R1, but that pass may not be a shortest pass. To synthesize a shortest prefix, we use breadth first search from the initial state until the leader is reached. We now explain how we synthesize R2. Consider that for each satisfiable sub-constraint, the optimal strongly connected component has a set of states that are accepting for that Buki automaton of that sub-constraint. The optimal component has also a set of accepting states of the product automaton, which is FC5P in this example. The suffix R2 we synthesize must contain a state of each of those sets. Because we want to make R2 as short as possible, we use BFS iteratively. We start BFS starting from the leader to reach a state of unvisited set. Once that state is reached, we mark that set as visited and then start doing BFS from there until we visit a new state that belongs to an unvisited set. We again mark that set as visited and start doing BFS. We do BFS iteratively until all the sets are visited. And from there, we perform one more DFS to reach the leader to form the cycle. The cycle R2 is formed by concatenating all those shortest paths found by BFS. For implementation, we don't make or maintain those sets, we only use a vector. We improve the quality of solution by letting instead of the leader the first state among those sets to which BFS reaches from the leader to be the midpoint of the lasso. Accordingly, R1 needs to be a shortest path from the initial state to the new midpoint. The time complexity of our algorithm to compute a short lasso with minimum cost on P is in big O(n) multiplied by the size of P. This bound becomes linear if n is treated constant. We provide an algorithm for our problem. Now we consider a situation where the relative order of the sub-constraints is changed while the robot is already following a path generated by the algorithm. In this case, the robot doesn't need to reconstruct the product automaton. It even doesn't need to recompute the set of strongly connected components, but only needs to synthesize a new lasso. This can save a considerable amount of time used to construct the product automaton. Here in this example, the fourth constraint gets higher priority than the third constraint, and accordingly, C6 becomes an optimal, strongly connected component and the robot synthesizes a new lasso. The first case study considers a robot located in a hospital. The robot is tasked to infinitely often deliver first aid items to primary care and emergency department, to infinitely often deliver medicines to pharmacy, and to infinitely often visit the maintenance department. A part of the transition system for this case study that involves the primary care department and the corridor is shown here. It took 201 seconds for our algorithm to compute a solution for this case study, while the brute force algorithm failed to compute a solution in 15 hours. The brute force algorithm considers any vertex within any optimal strongly connected component to be the midpoint of a lasso, and it finds an optimal lasso at that midpoint by considering from the smallest one all cycles starting from that midpoint. In this case study, the robot is tasked to infinitely often visit each of the common rooms and the toy room, and it is given 6 sub-constraints. Our algorithm computed a solution in 21 seconds, while it took more than 3,000 seconds for the brute force algorithm to compute a solution. In this experiment, we swapped the relative order of sub-constraints 5 and 6, while a path was already generated for the retirement home case study. We considered that the computation time was only 20 milliseconds. We also did an experiment to study the solution quality of our algorithm. We considered 4 graph sizes, and for each we generated 100 graphs randomly, and on each graph we executed both our greedy algorithm and the brute force algorithm. The average running time of our algorithm was much more better, and the greedy algorithm even couldn't compute solution for some graphs within a time window of 20 minutes it had for each graph. Based on the last column, the length of a lasso generated by our algorithm is on average between 2 to 2.4 of the optimal shortest lasso. We also show in this chart the distribution of the sizes of the lassos produced by our algorithm for the 100 graphs of size 100. In conclusion, a lasso generated by our algorithm is usually within a factor of 2 to 2.4 of a shortest lasso. Future work considers better algorithm to improve approximation ratio, different approach that doesn't require product automata reconstruction, learning the self-constraints, and the case of dynamic environments.